Hey guys, it is a beautiful afternoon after this little thunderstorm came through. So the rain stopped and now I can shoot my video without any background rain noise. I want to take some time and I want to talk about plastic rubber lures, plastic baits they call them, or plastic worms. In bass fishing and other kinds of fishing, these rubber worms and these plastic baits are really effective baits. And so I wanted to go through some basics. Now I know there are many ways to do these lures. And if you have ideas and things, you're welcome to comment. I just want to get some basics down because when I was younger, and we're talking like 1980, the only way to learn stuff was to watch one or two fishing shows or buy all the In-Fisherman magazines that I could get my hands on. So it's amazing that people can learn bass fishing from a couple videos. So that's my goal. I want to give you some rubber worm basics. So before we get started on rigging, let's just take a quick look at the assortment of worms that I have. So I'm going through my boxes here, and these are, I'm going to start with a word. You're going to hear this one a lot. This is called a Senko. Senko is actually a brand of lure, but it's basically a heavy, thick, straight worm. And there are some really unique ways that you can rig this. We're going to talk about in just a little bit. But I have one box with Senkos, a modest assortment. Yes, I know. Okay, my next box, I've got some plastic worms, and I've got different sizes. These are pretty big ones. This is about an 8-inch worm right there. We've got some shorter worms, and then I have what I call creature baits. These are things that look like crayfish and whatever this thing is supposed to look like. But actually, these are really effective for bass, and they imitate a lot of food that they eat, and there are some also unique ways that you can rig them. So I'm moving on to my next bait, and my next bait are what we call soft plastic jerk baits, or flukes they call them. But basically, it's a plastic bait that's shaped like a minnow. It's got actually a top section and a bottom, and they even have a little slot for rigging, and we're going to show you that in a little bit. And they come in an assortment of sizes, and some are just downright fishy looking, if you ask me, in a good way. These are fantastic lures. The original one was the Sluggo, and I have a little one right here. But now all kinds of companies make them. That's a Sluggo right there. And their colors are amazing, by the way. So then we're going into another box, and this is my drop shot box. And the thing you'll notice about these worms is they are delicate and tiny. And this is another kind of worm for a very specific kind of fishing. And you'll notice something about the drop shot worm. They're very supple. They wiggle. When you twitch your rod, they wiggle a ton. I'm going to show you why it works that way. So let's go ahead and pack all this stuff up, and we're going to step over to my work table and go through some of the riggings. So as we're getting started, got a couple more boxes to put away. There you go. A little side thing. I have come up with, this is probably my organizational system that I like the best. I used to carry the one tackle box that had all the pockets and pouches, and now we've moved to this. So I've got all these things labeled. Here's all my hard baits. Here's my spoon spinners and things like that, bobbers and terminal tackle, and then here's all my soft baits. So I can grab the box I want, throw it in my boat or throw it in a duffel bag, and I'm on my way. So, all right, back to our worms. I'm going to put this up in my little holder, and let's get started. Okay, before we get into any of these fancy ones, I want to go back to the granddaddy of all worm rigs. Okay, I'm going to take a regular worm here. I'm going to set it down. And we're going to take a worm hook. It's a worm hook because it's got this little notch. And I'll show you the head of the worm sits in that notch. And this is called a wide gap worm hook. The wide gap gives you more hooking space. You'll see when I rig this. If I'm using a thicker worm, and actually, to be honest, most of the time I use wide gap hooks anyway. So the idea is I want to take this and I want to create something that's completely weedless. And like I said, this is the granddaddy of worm rigs. It's called the Texas rig. So here's what you do. You take the worm and you take the hook, and I'm going to go in as far as that little notch is. So for me, it looks like about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to go in, and then I'm going to come out the side. Okay, see how this is going? I'm going to slide this all the way, and I'm going to rotate the hook. Now, you can see the hook is laying on top of the worm, and I'm going to find that spot where the shank of the hook, right at the bottom, lines up with the worm. The worm is nice and straight, and I'm just going to take and I'm going to bury that in the worm. And if I've done this right, you've got a completely weedless worm here. The hook is buried inside, When a fish bites, the idea is the fish will push down, and when you set the hook, it's going to push that hook out through the worm like that. So this is really weedless. You can throw this in bushes, trees, weeds, logs, and that isn't going to hook up on anything. You can fish it like this. You can also slide a bullet sinker. These sinkers are shaped like a bullet. It's made to work with worms. And what this will do is this is going to slide up and down the line and give you some weight when you're casting. It'll also take the worm down to the bottom. A lot of people like to do this. This is a toothpick that I've cut in half. Once this is on your line, you stick this in the back, you push it in, you break it off, and what it'll do is that sinker is now going to stay wherever I leave it. So I'm going to go ahead and show you real quick and rig that up. Might as well. So I'm going to take my line. I am threading it through my bullet sinker. I'm going to tie my worm on. Okay, I'm just doing a simple clinch knot. That's pretty much what I use. Yes, I know there are many, many, many new knots out there, but I am very confident in this one. Do 3 or 4 twists. I'm going to get it wet. Snug it down. Okay, ready to go. And you can see the sinker slides. The problem with that is if I throw it into like a tree that's in the water, I can have the worm land on one side of a branch and the sinker land on the other, then this is creating a problem for me because they can separate. So what we do is you take the split shot, you put it in the hole in the bottom of the sinker, you push it in hard, and then you break the tip off. Now that sinker will stop wherever I want it to, and it's tight to the line. And then I'll slide it down. This is ready to rock. That bait right there I can throw, like I said, almost anywhere. I can bounce it off that guy's canopy on his pontoon boat, and I'm not going to hook the canopy, and I'm not going to get yelled at by some person whose beautiful house is on the lake. So, Texas rig, the granddaddy of all worm rigs. And then somebody came along and said, well, maybe you're not fishing an area that's so weedy, so full of tangles, so what if you make it a little easier to hook up? So I'm going to take a step back. We're going to unhook this worm. And I see where this lines up. And we're going to do this again, except we're going to leave the hook exposed on top of the worm. So we're going to go like this. I'm going to push it through all the way, and now instead of being buried, you can see the hook is resting on top of the worm. And what I can do is I can pull the worm forward and just put the hook, the tip of the hook, just a sliver of rubber over the tip. This is also very weedless, but here's the thing. Now I'm not punching through that whole worm when I set the hook. I'm just, you can see, just a little tiny piece of rubber there, and then boop, there it is. That's called a Texposed rig. The hook is riding on top. It's lightly covered in, so it's fairly weedless, but it hooks up a little better than a Texas rig. If you're fishing a little lighter cover, you can get away with this, okay? That is probably the main basic way to rig worms, but there are more. So we mentioned the Texposed rig. So I'm going to go back to one of my flukes, one of my little plastic jerk baits. And what's great, these fish awesome with that Texposed thing, and I'm going to show you why. This worm on the bottom, you see it has a slot. That's where the hook sits. So I'm going to do the same thing with the worm. I'm going to push it in about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to come out the bottom. You can see this bait has a bottom. It's got this fat bottom. This slit rides on the bottom, okay? I'm going to slide it up, and I'm going to twist the hook and rotate it. And now it's ready to go up in there. So I'm going to open up that flap. I'm going to find the spot where that hook lines up, and I'm going to go straight up through it. And now you've got this really great, mostly weedless fluke. You can cast this and twitch it around. It is a phenomenal bait, okay? This has little, I'm going to bury that hook in. Now this is almost completely weedless. I can fish it on top of weeds, through weeds. You fish these by twitching them, and they have a really erratic action. So they get a lot of bites. It's a fantastic triggering lure. If you can see fish and you can get this in front of them, you're probably going to trigger them to bite, okay? That same Texas and Texposed rig also works on creature baits. So here we have a creature bait. This is like a crayfish type imitation. They come in all shapes and sizes, but the rigging is very similar. I'm going to take this wide gap hook again. I'm going to put it through about a 1/4 inch, bring it out the bottom, and I'm going to twist that hook around. And just like the other ones, I'm going to find the spot where that hook comes through. And it's right towards the head, so I'm going to bring it through. And then I've got this beautiful thing. It's even got a groove here that tip can sit down in. This is quite weedless without even hooking the rubber, but just to be safe, I'm going to give it a little snug. Now, much like the worm, you can attach a bullet sinker on the front, and this thing will look like a crayfish coming through the water. You fish it with twitches. But the two things we've talked about Texas rigged, and I'm going to do that one again. Texas rigged is where the hook is buried in the worm, buried hard in the worm. And this is for heavy cover. And then we've talked about Texposed, where the hook is laying on top of the worm, and you just sliver hook the top to get it weedless. Okay? This is an assortment of ways that you use that rigging. Texas rig, Texposed rig. Okay? I'm going to set these aside, and we're going to move on to some other baits and some other ways that I do rigging. I'm showing you basically the simplest, most basic ones. So, along came that lure that I showed you earlier, and this is called a Senko. Now, this lure looks like a worm, and you could rig it like one of these. So, I'm going to set that back out here. You could rig it Texas style in the front with a thing, and it would fish like a regular worm. But what you can also do, someone must have been bored in their boat, and they decided, what happens if I hook it in the middle? So they took a hook, okay, and they hooked it in the middle of the worm. And what happened was, you're going to see there's a little black thing. Just ignore that for now. This hooked in the middle, this worm now, when it was dropping, had a shimmy to it. And it was a phenomenal bass trigger. So people began wacky rigging these worms. They would take the hook and hook it in the middle like this. The problem with that rig, though, is that after 1 or 2 hook sets, you tear the worm right apart. And so somebody figured out, hey, let's do this. Instead, this is the rig. It almost looks like a pen, and someone put this on the end. And this is a little black O-ring. And somebody figured out, what if you put an O-ring on the worm in the middle, then you hook it through the O-ring. And what you're doing instead of hooking and tearing rubber is you're giving the hook something to hold on to. Okay? So you ended up with something that looks like this. You can see the O-ring in the middle. Okay? And what people would then do is they would hook through the O-ring, and that really gave it a sturdy thing to hook onto. And this worm would drop. But you'll notice when I hook through the O-ring, my hook is sideways. I don't personally care for that. I think I want the hook up and down so I can get a good shot at that bass's upper jaw. I think the hooking is better if I do this differently. So we took this O-ring thing and we went one step further. And I actually began to tie O-rings to my wacky rig hooks. By the way, this is called a wacky rig when you hook it in the middle. It's a wacky rig. I use braided line. I wrap it about 4 times and tie a fishing knot right there, snug it down. And I want to show you what this does. Now I slip this onto my thing. And I've got one pre-rigged here. I slide it over top of the worm. And what I've got now is I've got a wacky rigged worm, but look how my hook is sitting now. My hook is up and down vertical. And I like that better. That gives me a good shot at hooking that upper jaw. Okay, and that's how it rigs. So we've got the wacky rig, and we've modified it so that the hook rides up and down. You can do it with the hook sideways. It does work. I'm more confident with this. This takes a little preparation ahead of time, but if I prep 5 or 6 of these hooks, I'm ready to go. And that's a great rig to do. Probably the main thing I fish if I'm moving around docks and cover is this wacky rig. You pitch it out, you let it sink to the bottom. It's going down and it's doing that shimmy, that wiggle. No weight on it, by the way. Okay? It hits the bottom, and if I don't get picked up or bit on the bottom, I'll lift my rod, and it's going to do that same thing. I'll lift it maybe 12 inches and let it just settle down to the bottom. 2 or 3 of those, reel on in and target your next spot. Okay? So we have Texas rig, Texposed. We have wacky rigs here. This covers an awful lot of kinds of fishing, but sometimes bass are a little deeper and they're in a pinpoint spot you want to really target. And that's where this last technique comes in. This is called drop shot rig. Okay? So what I want to do, I actually bought some very special drop shot hooks. And if you can see this, it's a hook and it's got a swivel on the top and bottom, so I can tie lines directly to. If you don't, what you have to do is do a Palomar knot in place of where the swivel is. But because I have the swivel, I'm going to show you how this rigs up. I'm going to turn this thing, and the hook is up and down. One swivel is on the bottom, so I'm going to tie my line to it. I'm going to try really hard to thread this. You guys are probably going, come on, old guy with no glasses, tie that knot. Here we go. All right. I'm going to tie my knot. Okay, this knot is this piece of line I've got here is about anywhere from 12 to about 24 inches. And this is the distance that your worm is going to be off the bottom. Okay, I'm going to finish tying this. Okay, got it. I'm going to snug my knot. All right, so where my finger is on the bottom is where the sinker is going to go. I actually have some super cool sinkers here, and what these do, I could measure out about 12 to 18 inches, cut it, and tie a small sinker on the bottom. This is actually a drop shot sinker, and what it does, if you thread through the hole in the top, all you have to do is figure out how high you want it and tighten it, and it will hold that spot. So watch what we've got here now. We've got, I'm going to shorten this up just a little. We've got about 18 inches of line, and it goes down to my thing. I'm going to shorten this. There we go. Okay. So now I need to make the connection to my rod. So I'm going to tie, we'll say that this is a line coming from my rod. Okay, I'm going to tie it on at the top. Okay. Got my fishing knot. I would probably use some pretty light or fairly difficult to see line in this rig. Something like a fluorocarbon, and line weight, you're going to match it to your situation. A good basic weight might be 8 or 10 pound, and for heavier situations, you could go a little heavier. Okay, so here's what we have. I want to show you. This is coming from my fishing pole. I'm going to set that. That's my pole. It comes down to this hook, and then there's about 18 inches of line, 16 inches, and then I've got the sinker on the bottom. Okay, I want to now attach my worm to this hook. So this rig, as you can see, it sits on the bottom. My worm sits up here. Let's put that worm on here. Okay, this is probably more designed to imitate a minnow than a worm, and I'm going to hook it just through the nose. And there we go. So here's my rig. I have my sinker, I have my drop shot, and then this goes up to my rod. Now picture what happens here when I'm fishing this. Okay, when I cast, this lure is going to shoot down to the bottom. Sinker hits the bottom. This worm slowly sinks down by it. Okay. Now my rod is slack and everything's laying on the bottom. And if I lightly pick up about 12 inches, here's what's going on underwater. I'm right here now. Okay. I've got this worm. I've got the sinker on the bottom. And before I start moving, I'm just going to raise and lower my tip of my rod. I want to feel that sinker weight, and then I want to ease against that sinker weight back down. And what it's going to do is it just makes this lure dance right in place. And this is great for bass that are really tight to cover, sitting on a structure, and you really want to pinpoint that spot. Okay? So you can picture I'm tied off to my rod, and as I raise up, there's the weight of the sinker, so I'm going to ease back down, and now I'm just going to lift it up a couple times. Okay, then I'm going to move that sinker, and I'm going to do it again. I'm going to raise and lower a couple times. It's going to swim and swim. I'm going to hold, and usually the fish will come up and take it. You don't have to fish it too long in one spot. So I'd raise and lower 2 or 3 times, and then I would pinpoint another spot. The genius of this rig is that it targets specific fish, especially tight to rocks, tight to cover, and it keeps that bait in front. This is not a high attracting thing. It's not pulling fish from far away, but this is a high triggering lure, which means get it in front of a fish and do this, and you're almost guaranteed to get that fish to bite. Okay, so that's my drop shot rig. Okay, I'm going to walk through again for heavy, heavy cover, Texas rig. Okay, when cover's a little lighter, I can get away with a Texposed rig where the hook's riding on top of the worm. Okay, if I'm pinpointing docks and the water's not too deep, a wacky worm is a great way to go. You'll even see these are weedless wacky hooks. These are awesome. I can chuck these just about anywhere and not have someone yelling at me for cooking the canopy on their pontoon boat. Okay, and then for deeper water, targeting structure on the bottom, then I can go to my drop shot rig. Okay, as I said, there are other ways of rigging worms. I don't want to overwhelm people who are getting started in this. This is a great way to do it. I'm going to pull my camera here. If I could only take a few ways, and I'd say 4 ways. I've got Texas rig, Texposed, wacky worm, drop shot. If you can get those 4 things down, you have a ton of ways to fish plastic worms and baits like that, and a ton of options that can cover a lot of different situations, and that puts you on fish and puts fish in your live well or in your pictures and back in the water, whichever you're doing. I hope that's helpful. A little bit on plastic worms and rigging. I'm going to do another video on some strange ways to rig things, because once you've got these, there are a lot of other crazy things you can do. So, hope it's helpful. Hope to catch you on the water.